Agriculture Ministers of the BRICS countries have signed a joint declaration ahead of the BRICS Head of State Summit in Sandton next week. The joint declaration includes an agreement to help the most vulnerable people in societies to get food and to work together against climate change to ensure that food production is not affected. Thoko Didiza is the Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. Minister, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. We all know food prices are incredibly high at the moment. Farmers also having a difficult time. How important is this declaration? What have you agreed to with the agriculture ministers of the other BRICS countries?
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, and also to your listeners. As you've indicated already, that one of the things that we've looked at is how do we ensure access to food for the most vulnerable population. Obviously, in this area, there are other important sectors that are important. On one hand, we've agreed to increase agricultural production, taking into consideration what we need to do in terms of our production system such that we take into consideration the impact of climate change. Therefore, it means our methods of production will have to adapt. Secondly, how do we utilize water resources, particularly in those areas where there's water scarcity, and how do we ensure that we improve our resources, genetic resources of animals as well as crops, such that they can become resistant to drought, particularly where we're facing El Nino in some of the areas or drought. Secondly, we would also need to work together with our trade departments so that the issues of trade flows are actually facilitated amongst the BRICS countries, but also as members of BRICS, who are also part of the World Trade Organization. We also want to ensure that we work closely so that the transformation within the WTO in ensuring that there is fair trade in agriculture is actually enhanced. Also at local level, to ensure that our retail sector take into consideration that the price, movements are such that it doesn't become out of reach of ordinary citizens.
There are many aspects to it, and you talk about trade policy, and Minister, trade, as you know, is incredibly complicated. Just before the meeting, and you spent 4 days, as I understand it, with the Brazilian Agriculture Minister, our Minister of Finance and our Minister of Trade, Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, reimposed, they're quite small, but they reimposed trade tariffs on Brazilian chicken, which is being imported into South Africa. It's really dumping. It's being imported at below the cost it costs Brazilian farmers to produce it. There are important reasons why that is. Did that come up at all?
It did come out in our bilateral meeting with the Brazil Deputy Minister. He did raise his concern, appreciating, of course, that amongst their industry, there may be 5 or so companies that have flouted the trade rules that does fall within the scope of dumping. And unfortunately, you cannot make regulations that penalizes 5 out of many. Any trade rules that you put in place ensures that that country from whom we are importing must deal with their exporters so that they avoid dumping. And therefore, he appreciates that we had to put this tariff in place, which is really an anti-dumping instrument. And they will have to take responsibility as, Brazil to ensure that their companies comply.
If you look at the situation around food prices, it's a big issue for us, a big issue in India, and I suspect a big issue in China as well. Are you expecting that to be a big conversation during the Heads of State Summit next week? Are you expecting more to come on all of this next week?
I must say that all the 5 member countries, including the heads of state, are concerned about the issues of food security, as well as the impact of global shocks, which have increased prices in a number of countries internationally, including amongst BRICS countries, as well as agricultural inputs, because those also have seen an increase, which is the reason why the concern for everybody, including ministers of agriculture, including heads of state, about what we need to do to ensure that we alleviate food insecurity in our countries.
Minister, I really appreciate the time. Thank you. The Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, Thoko Didiza.